I promised your wife I'd bring her home. Morgan Tate, tall, broad-shouldered, with wind-scarred cheekbones and iron-gray eyes, froze at the threshold of his mountain cabin. Standing on the porch was Lenora Quinn, slight yet unflinching auburn curls dusted with snow. Cradled against her chest, wrapped in a sunrise pink quilt, was a newborn girl whose copper-tinged lashes matched the memory of Grace Tate, the wife Morgan had buried 2 winters ago. One look at that tiny fist unraveled every plank of solitude he'd nailed across his heart. Carried would shatter the life he'd built from grief and force him to face the love he'd buried long ago. The knock came just after sundown, sharp, hurried, almost frantic. Morgan Tate's hand still on the coffee tin, his eyes narrowing as the second knock followed quicker this time. Nobody came out this far unless they were desperate or lost. He pushed back from the table boots, thewing softly against the worn planks, and opened the door. A young woman stood there, snow clinging to her shawl, her face pale beneath the fading light. Her arms cradled something close, something small swaddled tight in a threadbare blanket. She didn't speak at first, just looked at him like a hunted thing, too scared to breathe. Then her lips parted, voice trembling, as though the words themselves might break her. "I was sent by your wife." Morgan froze, the words cut deeper than any blade. His wife Grace had been gone nearly 2 years, buried on the hill behind the house, beneath the lone cottonwood. He hadn't spoken her name out loud in months. Yet here stood this stranger, clutching a baby to her chest like it was her last tether to life. The baby stirred, then a tiny whimper rising into the cold air. Morgan's eyes fell to the bundle, and his chest tightened. "Who are you?" he rasped. "My name's Lenora," she said, voice soft but steady, despite the fear in her eyes. "And this is your daughter." For a heartbeat, the world tilted. Morgan's hand gripped the doorframe, his mind roaring with too many questions at once. He'd lived these past 2 years like a ghost. Work, eat, sleep, repeat. Just enough to keep the ranch alive and the ache buried. Now here was this woman, this baby, and a claim that felt impossible yet burned with the weight of truth. "Come inside," he said finally, voice rougher than he intended. Lenora stepped in, boots crunching softly on the threshold. The cabin was warm but sparse. Clean table, 2 chairs, fire low in the hearth. Morgan shut the door behind her, the wind howling against the wood as though furious at being shut out. She sat stiffly on the edge of the chair, clutching the baby close. Morgan remained standing, arms folded, his eyes locked on the bundle in her arms. She said, "Your wife sent you." Lenora nodded, fingers trembling as she smoothed the baby's blanket. "Before she died, she wrote me, told me where to find you. Said you needed to know." Morgan's jaw worked, but no words came. Instead, he reached for the chair opposite her and sank down like a man much older than his years. "What happened?" he finally asked. Lenora hesitated. "It's a long story, and not all of it's easy to hear." Morgan's eyes flicked to the baby tiny face barely visible beneath the folds of fabric. The child shifted softly, letting out a fragile sigh that sliced through him in a way he wasn't prepared for. "You best start telling it," he said quietly. Lenora drew in a shaky breath and began. The wind outside battered the windows as Lenora spoke her words, halting at first, then gathering strength like a creek breaking free from ice. She told him about Grace, how she'd met her months after leaving town for treatment, far from anyone who knew her name. How Grace had been weak but hopeful, how they'd shared stories like old friends even as Grace's strength failed, and how before the end Grace had taken Lenora's hands and begged her to carry out one last wish. She said, "You'd have stopped living when she got sick," Lenora whispered. "Said she didn't want you to spend your life alone, not knowing you still had a part of her left in this world." Morgan's throat burned. He stared at the table, unable to meet Lenora's gaze. Every word was a blow. Each memory of Grace too sharp, too vivid, like her voice might echo in the room if he dared breathe too loudly. The baby stirred again, a faint mewl escaping her lips. Lenora rocked her gently, her own expression softening. "She wanted you to raise her," Evelyn said, looking at him, now eyes bright with unshed tears. "Said you'd know what kind of life to give her." Morgan's hands curled into fists against his knees. He'd spent 2 years burying himself in work and silence, in the cold certainty that his best years were over. And now this, a child, Grace's child, his child. But doubt gnawed at him too. He didn't know how to be a father, didn't know if he deserved the chance after the way he'd failed Grace in those final months. Too scared to hope, too broken to fight for more time. Before he could speak, the baby's cries sharpened high and insistent. Lenora moved to stand, but Morgan rose first instinct, overruling thought. Here, he said, voice softer than he meant. Lenora blinked, hesitated, then carefully placed the baby in his arms. The bundle was light, so impossibly light, but the weight of her, the warmth of her tiny body stole the air from his chest. She opened her eyes then, just barely dark, and searching like Grace's had been. Morgan felt something crack open in him, something raw and terrifying but alive. She looks like her, he murmured. Lenora's breath hitched. I know. The fire popped in the hearth sparks, leaping as if to punctuate the moment. Outside, the wind wailed through the trees like a mournful song. Morgan held the baby closer, and for the first time in 2 years, the numbness that had ruled his life began to shift. But even as warmth spread through the cabin, a new sound reached them. Distant hoofbeats, faint but steady, growing closer with every passing second. Lenora's head snapped up, fear flashing in her eyes. Morgan felt it too, the instinct honed from years of ranch life, of knowing trouble when it came calling. Who knows you're here? He asked sharply. Lenora's silence was answer enough. The hoofbeats grew louder. Morgan set the baby back in Lenora's arms and reached for the rifle above the door. This wasn't just a visitor. Trouble was coming fast. The hoofbeats grew louder. No longer distant, but deliberate, unhurried in a way that carried its own kind of menace. Morgan's grip on the rifle tightened as he stepped to the side of the door. Every sense sharpened. Lenora rose slowly, clutching the baby close to her chest, as though she might shield the child from whatever was about to come. Her wide eyes never left the door. Through the narrow gap in the shutters, Morgan caught sight of 3 riders cresting the rise. Their silhouettes were stark against the bruised horizon, the setting sun outlining them in gold and crimson. Even from here, he could tell they weren't cowhands just passing through. The lead rider sat too straight, his coat too fine for work, his posture too sure of himself. The 2 behind him hung back just enough to make it clear who held the power among them. Morgan felt his jaw tighten. Men who came like this never brought good news. The riders slowed as they approached the porch. The lead man swung down from his saddle with the easy grace of someone used to being obeyed. He removed his gloves deliberately, his eyes scanning the cabin, like a man already deciding what belonged to him. Evening, he called, voice smooth as polished stone. Morgan didn't answer. He stepped slightly forward, rifle cradled in his hands, not yet aiming, but making no attempt to hide it. The man's eyes flicked to the weapon briefly before returning to Morgan's face. You, Tate? The man asked, like it wasn't really a question. Morgan said nothing, his silence enough of an answer. The man smiled faintly, the kind of smile that held no warmth. Name S.B. Barrett Kerrigan. Maybe you've heard of me. Morgan's stomach nodded. He knew the name. Everyone within 2 counties did. Kerrigan wasn't an outlaw in the usual sense. He didn't rob banks or hold up stagecoaches. He didn't need to. Men like Kerrigan used deeds debts and hired guns the way other men used bullets, and they always got what they wanted. Kerrigan's gaze slid past Morgan to the faint lamplight within the cabin. Word is, a young lady came through town carrying something that don't rightly belong to her. Wouldn't happen to know anything about that, would you? Lenora's grip on the baby tightened. Morgan caught the motion in his periphery, the tremble in her hands. Can't help you, Morgan said flatly. Kerrigan chuckled, a sound like dry leaves crumbling. See, that's the thing about folks out here. They think they can just ignore certain truths, but the truth don't care. It catches up sooner or later. He stepped closer, boots crunching in the frozen dirt. Hand over the girl, Tate. We ain't here for you. No reason this has to get unpleasant. Morgan's finger twitched near the trigger. You ought to get back on that horse and ride out while you still can. One of Kerrigan's men shifted in the saddle hand, dropping toward his revolver. Morgan swung the rifle up fast enough to stop him cold. You want to test me? Morgan asked, voice low, steady as bedrock. Kerrigan's eyes hardened, the faint smile gone now. Careful, Tate. You know what happens when a man tries to stand alone. I've been alone a long time, Morgan said. For a moment, no one moved. Then Kerrigan's smirk returned, thinner, now colder. We'll be back come morning, he said, pulling his gloves back on. Think real hard about what matters most to you. A man like you don't have much left to lose. Be ashamed to watch the rest burn. He mounted his horse in one fluid motion. The other two men turned their mounts following without a word. Kerrigan didn't look back, but his parting words hung heavy in the air. "See you at dawn." The three riders vanished into the dark, their hoof beat-tats fading until only the wind remained. Inside the cabin, Lenora's face was ashen. "They know," she whispered. Morgan shut the door hard, sliding the bar into place. "You need to tell me everything," he said, voice sharper now the last of his patience burned away. Lenora sank into the chair, holding the baby close, as if shielding her from the weight of what she was about to confess. "Kerrigan, he's her blood," she said, nodding to the baby. "Grace's last month, she was hiding from him. He wanted the child for himself. Said he'd take her raise, her his way, cut you out of it entirely. She begged me to keep her safe, to get her to you before he could." Morgan's stomach turned to stone. "And you waited until now to tell me this?" "I didn't know he'd track me this far," Evelyn said, tears welling, despite her effort to hold them back. "I thought I could outrun him. I thought if I got here fast enough it would be over." Morgan paced to the window, the rifle still in his hands. He stared out at the darkness, swallowing the land. Kerrigan wasn't bluffing. Men like him never bluffed. They'd come back at dawn with more guns, more men. And Morgan knew he couldn't fight this fight alone. He turned to Lenora, his expression grim but resolute. "You and the baby stay inside. Don't open that door for anyone but me. Understand?" She nodded, too stunned to argue. Morgan pulled on his coat, his boots heavy on the floorboards as he crossed to the door. "Where are you going?" Lenora asked, voice tight with fear. "To find someone who owes me a favor," Morgan said without looking back. He stepped out into the night, the cold biting deep, the stars sharp against the endless dark. Each step away from the cabin felt heavier than the last, but he didn't stop. Somewhere out there past the ridges and frozen creeks lived the only man Morgan Tate trusted enough to call brother. But as he disappeared into the night, another pair of eyes watched from the tree line. Eyes that glinted with quiet malice before melting back into the dark. Kerrigan hadn't left entirely, and by morning Morgan would realize just how far the man was willing to go. Morgan followed the narrow trail that wound through the cottonwoods and out toward the ridge, boots crunching softly on the frozen ground. The cold bit deep, gnawing at his fingers, even through his gloves, but he didn't slow. His breath fogged in the moonlight, harsh and uneven, every step carrying the weight of what he was about to ask. Rufus Fletcher hadn't seen him in nearly a year. The man lived alone in a ramshackle cabin at the base of Dry Creek, a good 3 miles from Morgan Spread. Rufus had once been his closest friend, more brother than blood. But life had a way of carving deep distances between men. Morgan hadn't spoken to many folks since Grace died, and Rufus hadn't pushed him. But if there was anyone who'd stand at his side come morning, it was Rufus. By the time Morgan reached the cabin, the moon was high silver light spilling through the trees. A faint glow flickered through the cracks of the shuttered windows. Morgan raised a fist and knocked hard. The door opened a moment later, revealing Rufus, tall, raw-boned, his hair longer and wilder than Morgan remembered, eyes squinting against the sudden cold. For a heartbeat, Rufus just stared at him. "Tate," he said finally, voice flat with surprise. "Didn't think I'd see you again, least of all in the dead of night." "Coley," Morgan said simply. Rufus's expression shifted, the muscles in his jaw tightening. "You in trouble?" "Not just me," Morgan replied. "He's coming for a child. Grace's child. My child." That last admission landed heavy between them. Rufus's eyes widened slightly, but he didn't press. "You'd best come in," Rufus said, stepping aside. The cabin was rougher than Caleb's, but warm. A rifle leaned against the hearth tools scattered across a scarred table. Rufus poured 2 cups of coffee without asking, setting one in front of Morgan as he sat. "You saying Grace had a child after she left?" Rufus asked carefully. Morgan nodded, fingers tightening around the tin cup. "She sent someone to bring her to me. Kerrigan's been after them. He knows where we are now. Said he'd be back at dawn." Rufus leaned back in his chair, studying him with the same steady gaze he'd always had. "What are you asking me?" Tate Morgan met his eyes. "I can't hold them off alone. I need someone I trust at my back." For a long moment, Rufus said nothing. Then he stood slow and deliberate. "You never had to ask." Relief flooded Morgan in a way he hadn't expected. Rufus crossed to the corner, pulling down a worn rifle and a bandolier of ammunition. "You're lucky I've been saving these for a rainy day," Rufus said, almost a ghost of a grin, touching his lips. "Guess tomorrow's close enough." But even as they made ready checking rifles, packing cartridges, Morgan's mind was elsewhere. Back at the cabin, Lenora would be pacing the baby cradle close, waiting for him to return. And somewhere in the darkness, Kerrigan's men were no doubt already planning how to make good on their threat. By the time Morgan and Rufus stepped out into the night again, the stars had dimmed under gathering clouds. A storm was rolling in silent and slow as though the land itself held its breath. At the cabin, Lenora sat by the fire, unable to sleep, despite the baby's steady breathing against her chest. Every creak of the timbers made her flinch. Every gust of wind against the shutters set her heart racing. She glanced toward the door for what felt like the 100th time, wishing Morgan would return already. Then, faint at first but growing louder, came the sound of boots on the porch. Her breath caught. "Morgan," she whispered. No answer. The latch shifted. Lenora rose, clutching the baby tight, her eyes fixed on the door. "Who's there, still silent?" The latch clicked fully, this time slow, deliberate. Before she could react, the door creaked open and a shadow filled the threshold. It was Morgan. The man stepped in with a predator's ease face, half hidden beneath the brim of his hat. His eyes gleamed as they settled on the bundle in her arms. "Well," he drawled softly, "looks like I found what we came for." Lenora's throat went dry. The man took a step forward, one hand hovering near the revolver at his hip. "You scream," he said calmly, "and I shoot you dead before the echo fades." Her mind raced. Morgan wasn't here. She had nothing but the baby in her arms and the fire at her back. Then her eyes darted to the poker resting against the hearth. She shifted slightly, cradling the baby tighter. "Don't," the man warned, his voice cold as the night outside. Lenora didn't think. She lunged for the poker with her free hand, swinging it with every ounce of strength she had. The iron connected with his forearm, the blow jarring her wrist. He cursed, stumbling back, and Lenora bolted for the bedroom door, clutching the baby close as the man's shout filled the cabin. He recovered fast fury, twisting his features as he drew his gun. But before he could fire, the door behind him burst open. Morgan and Rufus standing there, rifles raised, eyes blazing. The man froze his gun halfway up. "Drop it," Morgan barked. For a second it seemed like he might try his luck. Then he let the gun clatter to the floor. Rufus moved fast, kicking the weapon out of reach while keeping his rifle trained on the intruder. "Kerrigan's got more men." The man spat hatred in his voice. "You won't make it to morning." Morgan stepped closer, his voice low, deadly calm. "Then you'd better pray you don't either." The man's smirk faltered. Rufus, Morgan said, never taking his eyes off the intruder. "Tie him up. We'll deal with the rest at dawn." Rufus nodded, already pulling rope from his pack. But even as they bound the man's hands, Lenora's mind churned. Kerrigan wasn't going to wait for dawn. Somewhere out there in the dark, his men were already moving. And the storm that had been gathering wasn't just in the sky. The cabin felt smaller, with the intruder bound in the corner, his glare never leaving Morgan. As Rufus finished securing the knots, the baby stirred restlessly in Lenora's arms, sensing the tension in the air. Morgan stood near the door, rifle still in hand, his mind already racing ahead. Kerrigan's man had been too confident. He wasn't bluffing. More of them were coming, maybe even tonight. Rufus leaned against the table, wiping his hands on his trousers. "We can't stay boxed up in here, Tate. If Kerrigan's bringing numbers, we'll be cornered like rats come morning." Morgan knew he was right. "We move before first light," he said, voice low but steady. "Get the baby and Lenora to high ground past Dry Creek. They'll have a harder time tracking us if the storm holds." Lenora looked up sharply, eyes wide. "You're saying we run?" "I'm saying we survive," Morgan answered. He crouched slightly to meet her gaze, his voice softening. "Kerrigan won't stop until he has her. We give him the fight, here we lose. Out there, we've got a chance." Lenora swallowed hard, holding the baby tighter. "What if he finds us anyway? Then he finds more than he bargained for." Rufus muttered, checking the rounds in his rifle. The intruder chuckled darkly, the sound grating. "You think you can outrun him? Kerrigan's already got men on every trail. You'll be lucky to make it a mile." Morgan's eyes locked on the man, his expression like stone. "You'll find out how wrong you are." The hours dragged as they prepared. Rufus gathered supplies, cartridges, rope, a skin of water, what little food Morgan had stored. Lenora packed the baby's meager things, hands trembling as she folded the worn blanket Grace had sent with her. Every object felt heavier now, as if carrying the weight of the woman who had entrusted her with this impossible task. Outside, the wind howled louder, the storm closing in fast. Snow began to fall in thick swirling sheets, muffling sound and cloaking the world in white. It was both a curse and a blessing. It would slow them down, but it would slow Kerrigan's men too. By the time the first faint glow of dawn touched the horizon, they were ready. The intruder was gagged and tied to a post, his eyes blazing with silent fury as Morgan tightened the final knot. "You tell Kerrigan," Morgan said quietly, leaning close. He picked the wrong man to chase. They stepped out into the snow, the cold biting, deep their breaths clouding the air. Rufus led the way, rifle slung over his shoulder, but ready. Lenora followed close behind, the baby bundled tight against her chest, her eyes darting to every shadow. Morgan took the rear, scanning the ridge lines, every muscle taut with expectation. The snow was already ankle-deep, slowing their progress, but they pressed on. The land stretched wide and silent around them, the storm swallowing sound and sight alike. They demated halfway across the lower pasture when Rufus raised a hand, signaling them to stop. Morgan moved up beside him, eyes narrowing. At first he saw nothing, then a flicker of movement near the tree line. Figures emerged slowly from the white haze. Dark shapes on horseback, 1, 2, then 5 more behind them. Kerrigan's men. Too many, Rufus muttered. Morgan's heart pounded, but his voice stayed calm. "We don't stop. Stay low. Move." They pressed forward, snow crunching underfoot, the baby beginning to fuss softly. Lenora tried to soothe her, murmuring gently, but the sound carried. One of the riders turned his head sharply. "Go," Morgan barked. The riders broke into a gallop, snow spraying from hooves as they surged forward. Rufus dropped to a knee rifle, snapping to his shoulder. The crack of the shot echoed across the white expanse. One rider pitching sideways out of the saddle. The others didn't slow. Morgan fired next, his shot striking another horse square in the chest. The animal collapsed in a tangle, its rider thrown hard into the snow. "Keep moving," Rufus shouted. Lenora stumbled, nearly falling, but Morgan was there, steadying her before pushing her onward. The baby wailed louder now, the sound cutting through the storm. Another shot rang out, this one from behind them. Snow kicked up inches from Morgan's boots. "They're flanking," Rufus yelled. Morgan spun, firing blind into the white haze. A cry rang out. One less rider, but still too many. The tree-line loomed ahead, the dark shelter of the woods their only chance. "Almost there!" Morgan shouted, his voice ragged with effort. Rufus fired again, the sharp report blending with the thunder of hooves. Another rider fell, but the rest were closing in fast, their shouts growing louder. They burst into the tree's branches, whipping past snow falling in heavy clumps from above. The horses struggled in the deepening drifts, buying them precious seconds. Morgan grabbed Lenora's arm, pulling her toward a narrow gully half hidden by brush. Down there they scrambled down the slope, snow tumbling with them. Rufus slid in after rifle, already trained upward. The riders reached the gully's edge, their silhouettes stark against the pale dawn. One leaned forward in his saddle, eyes scanning the shadows below. Morgan raised his rifle finger, tightening on the trigger. But the man just smiled, and from behind them, deeper in the woods, came the sound of more horses. Kerrigan had outflanked them after all. Lenora's breath caught, clutching the baby close. Rufus's jaw tightened, his voice a grim whisper. "They've got us surrounded." Morgan's eyes flicked between the approaching riders and Lenora, whose face was pale but resolute. The storm howled around them, but inside the world felt unbearably still. "Stay behind me," Morgan said softly. He stepped forward, rifle steady, as the first of Kerrigan's men appeared through the trees, their guns already drawn. The first rider stepped through the trees with the kind of confidence that only came from believing victory was already his. His coat was fine dark wool, heavy with melting snow, and the way he sat in the saddle, tall, proud, untouchable, told Morgan exactly who it was. Barrett Kerrigan behind him, more men emerged, spreading in a slow arc that boxed Morgan, Rufus, Lenora, and the baby in the narrow gully. Guns glinted in the gray dawn light, each barrel steady, each pair of eyes watching for the slightest twitch. "Well now," Kerrigan drawled, voice smooth as ever. "Didn't take you for a man to run Tate. Guess grief changes a fella." Morgan didn't move, didn't lower his rifle. "You've got no claim on her," Kerrigan's smile thinned. "She's my blood, Tate, my brother's mistake. And I don't intend to let his name get dragged through the mud by certain choices your wife made. The words hit harder than any bullet could have. Morgan's jaw tightened his grip on the rifle, white-knuckled. Lenora's breath caught audibly behind him. "You watch your mouth," Rufus said coldly, his rifle trained on the man to Kerrigan's right. Kerrigan tilted his head slightly like he found the whole exchange mildly amusing. "You planning to shoot me, Rufus Fletcher? You ain't got enough bullets for all of us?" "You'd be the first," Rufus replied. For the first time, Kerrigan's smile faltered. "Give me the child," Kerrigan said finally, his voice turning colder, harder. "Walk away, I won't hunt you. Hell, I'll even let you keep this piece of land for a few more years before I take that too." Morgan stepped forward, placing himself squarely between Kerrigan and Lenora. "You're not taking her," Kerrigan's eyes hardened to steel. "Then you'll die with her." The moment stretched taut as wire. Snow fell in heavy clumps around them, each flake landing in silence too loud to bear. Then a shot cracked through the air, not from Morgan or Rufus, but from somewhere high on the ridge. One of Kerrigan's men jerked violently, tumbling out of the saddle. Chaos erupted. Rufus fired next, dropping the man closest to him. Morgan swung his rifle up, firing at Kerrigan, but the man wheeled his horse sharply, the bullet grazing past his shoulder. "Take them alive," Kerrigan bellowed. Men surged forward, boots slipping in the snow, guns barking. Morgan shoved Lenora behind a fallen log, pressing her down low as the baby wailed in terror. "Stay here," he shouted before spinning back, firing into the white haze as more of Kerrigan's men closed in. Rufus was already moving, grabbing one of the riderless horses and slapping it hard on the flank. The animal bolted into the fray, scattering men and buying precious seconds. From the ridge above, another shot rang out, then another. Whoever was up there was fast, methodical, each bullet dropping a man cleanly. "Go!" Rufus yelled, grabbing Lenora's arm and hauling her to her feet. "We've got cover." Morgan turned just in time to see Kerrigan spurring his horse down into the gully, eyes blazing with fury. Morgan's rifle clicked empty. He dropped it, reaching for the revolver at his hip as Kerrigan closed the distance. The two men locked eyes, and then Kerrigan's horse reared violently, screaming, as a shot from the ridge struck its flank. The animal toppled, throwing Kerrigan hard into the snow. Morgan lunged forward, revolver aimed squarely at Kerrigan's head, but Kerrigan only smiled even as blood trickled down his temple. "You think this ends with me?" Before Morgan could answer, a gunshot cracked close, so close he felt the heat of it pass his face. He spun to see another of Kerrigan's men leveling his revolver at Lenora. Morgan fired first. The man collapsed, snow darkening beneath him. Lenora stood frozen. The baby pressed tight against her chest, eyes wide with shock. "Move," Rufus barked, shoving her toward the ridge. From above, a voice shouted, rough but familiar, "Tate up here now." Morgan's heart jolted. He knew that voice. It had been years since he'd heard it, but there was no mistaking it. As Rufus and Lenora scrambled toward the slope, Morgan backed after them, revolver steady on Kerrigan, who still lay sprawled in the snow. Kerrigan only laughed softly, even as his men fell one by one to the hidden shooter above. "You think you've won, Tate," he rasped. "I've got more men than you've got friends, and I'll bury every last one of you before this is done." Morgan didn't answer. He just turned and ran, boots pounding through the snow as the last of Kerrigan's surviving men scattered under the relentless fire from the ridge. Lenora slipped once on the slope, nearly falling, but Rufus grabbed her arm and pulled her up. At the top, a figure emerged from the trees, tall, broad-shouldered rifle still smoking in his hands. Morgan stopped short, breathless, staring at the man he hadn't seen in almost a decade. Jonah Morgan said hoarsely. His brother Elias Tate lowered the rifle, his sharp blue eyes flicking from Morgan to Lenora to the wailing baby in her arms. "You've got explaining to do," Jonah said simply. But before Morgan could speak, a single gunshot split the air. And Kerrigan's men weren't finished after all. The gunshot came from below, echoing through the trees like thunder. Jonah shoved Morgan down instinctively, the bullet slicing a branch clean in half above them. Lenora screamed, clutching the baby close, as Rufus swung around, rifle up, scanning the slope. 3 of Kerrigan's men had regrouped in the gully, moving fast despite the deep snow. One fired again, the shot splintering bark inches from Elia's head. "Keep moving," Jonah barked, already dropping to one knee, rifle steady. His shot rang out clean and precise, and the lead rider toppled into the snow. Rufus grabbed Lenora's arm, practically hauling her up the ridge. "Go get to cover!" But Evelyn resisted, panic flooding her face as the baby shrieked in terror. "Morgan, I'm right behind you!" Morgan shouted, eyes never leaving the two remaining riders. He fired once, then, again dropping the second man before spinning to cover Jonah as he reloaded. The last rider didn't charge. Instead, he wheeled his horse, sharply retreating back toward the gully. "He's running for Kerrigan," Elias said grimly. "We've got minutes, maybe less." "Then we don't stay here," Morgan replied. They scrambled deeper into the forest, the snow swallowing the sound of their boots but slowing them to a crawl. Jonah led the way, moving with a practiced ease Morgan hadn't seen since before everything went wrong. Before Grace, before the fights, before the years that had turned brothers into strangers, Lenora stumbled, the baby wailing against her chest. Morgan was there, instantly steadying her, his hand firm on her shoulder. Almost there, just a little further. Rufus brought up the rear, his rifle sweeping the trees behind them. "We won't outrun horses if they get up here first." Elias didn't look back. "We won't need to." Minutes later, they reached a narrow ravine choked with fallen trees and jagged rock. A shallow cave yawned just ahead, half hidden by brush and ice. Jonah motioned them inside without a word. The cave was small, barely deep enough to shield them all, but it was shelter. Lenora sank to the ground immediately. The baby pressed tight to her chest, her hands trembling so violently she could barely pull the blanket tighter around the child. Morgan crouched beside her, brushing snow from her hair. "You're all right. You're safe." Lenora met his eyes, her voice breaking. "I thought I know," he said softly, cutting her off. "But I'm here. I'm not going anywhere." Outside, the forest was silent for a long moment. Then came the distant sound of horses, many of them approaching fast. Jonah leaned against the cave wall, loading fresh rounds into his rifle. "You've made yourself quite a mess, little brother." Morgan shot him a look. "Didn't ask for your help." "You didn't have to," Elias replied evenly. "Grace did." Morgan froze, his chest tightening. You knew." Elia's jaw flexed, eyes unreadable. "She wrote me months ago. Told me about the baby. Told me about Kerrigan. Told me she wasn't sure you'd still be alive by the time it mattered." The words landed like a blow. Morgan turned, slightly staring at Lenora, who looked down at the baby as if unable to meet his gaze. "She wanted me to be there if you couldn't be," Jonah continued quietly. "Looks like she got her wish." For a moment, no one spoke. Then Rufus, ever practical, cut in. "We don't have time for this. They're close." Jonah nodded, once eyes narrowing as the hoof-beat tats grew louder. "We hold them here. Force them into a choke point. Rufus, take the left ridge. Morgan, you stay low and cover the gully entrance. I'll pick them off before they get close enough to charge." Morgan hesitated, glancing at Lenora. "If we fail—" "You won't," Jonah said flatly. The first riders appeared moments later, black shapes against the swirling snow. Kerrigan was at their head now, his face hard, his coat flaring as his horse pounded through the drifts. There, one of his men shouted, pointing toward the ravine. Gunfire erupted. Elias' rifle cracked, the shot dropping the lead rider instantly. Rufus's shot followed a breath later, another man tumbling from the saddle. Kerrigan didn't slow. "Flank them!" he bellowed, spurring his horse forward as more men broke off to circle around. Morgan fired, hitting one in the shoulder. Another bullet whizzed past his ear, striking the cave wall with a sharp ping. "Keep their heads down," Elias shouted. The storm raged harder, wind tearing through the trees, snow whipping into their faces. Visibility dropped to nothing, but the gunfire only grew louder, sharper. Then through the white haze, Morgan saw movement on their left flank. "Rufus!" he shouted. "Rufus turned too late." One of Kerrigan's men lunged from the side rifle, swinging like a club. The blow landed hard, sending Rufus sprawling into the snow. Lenora screamed. Morgan's stomach lurched as the man raised his weapon again, ready to strike the final blow. But Jonah fired first. The man dropped where he stood, his body crumpling in the snow. Rufus groaned, rolling to his side, blood streaking his temple. "Still here," he muttered, voice slurred but alive. Kerrigan dismounted, then his boots sinking deep into the snow as he strode forward. "This ends now, Tate!" he roared, his revolver glinting in the dim light. "You can kill every man I've got, and I'll still take what's mine." Morgan stepped out from behind the fallen log, snow up to his knees, revolver raised. "She's not yours," Morgan said, voice steady, despite the pounding of his heart. Kerrigan's eyes burned with pure hatred. "Then she'll die with you." The two men locked eyes, the storm howling around them, everything else fading to nothing. For a heartbeat, neither moved. Then both fired at once. The shots echoed together, one sharp, one deep. And when the smoke cleared, one of them was still standing. The smoke drifted in the frozen air, curling between them like a ghost. Morgan stood rigid, revolver still aimed, his breath sharp and ragged. Kerrigan staggered back 2 steps, a look of disbelief etched across his face. His revolver slipped from his grasp, landing soundlessly in the deep snow. Blood bloomed across the front of his fine wool coat, staining it a dark, ugly red. "You!" Kerrigan rasped, voice thick with shock and hatred. "You think this changes anything?" Morgan didn't answer. Kerrigan swayed once more, his knees buckling. He collapsed forward face first into the snow and lay still. For a moment, no one moved. The storm seemed to hold its breath. Then one of Kerrigan's men shouted in panic, spurring his horse to flee. Another followed, then another. Within seconds, the survivors had turned tail, disappearing into the white haze, leaving their fallen leader behind. The sudden silence felt almost unbearable. Lenora's voice broke through it, trembling but urgent. "Morgan?" He turned just in time to see her crouched over Rufus, who was struggling to stay upright. Blood streaked his temple, but his eyes were open, sharp despite the pain. "I'm fine," Rufus muttered, though his voice was weaker than he liked to admit. Morgan dropped to his knees beside him. "You're bleeding like hell." "Been worse," Rufus said with a faint grin, wincing as he tried to sit up straighter. Jonah approached slowly, his rifle lowered, his eyes fixed on Kerrigan's still form in the snow. "You got him?" Morgan stared down at the man who had haunted so much of Grace's last months, the man who would have taken the baby without hesitation. He would never have stopped. Jonah met his eyes, something unspoken passing between them. "Then it's done." But Evelyn shook her head sharply. "No, it is. Kerrigan's men. He said he had more than just these." Morgan's chest tightened. She was right. This victory, if it could even be called that, wasn't the end. "We can't stay here," Morgan said finally, his voice steady again. "They'll come back for him, for her." They worked quickly, gathering what little they could carry. Jonah and Rufus dragged Kerrigan's body to the edge of the ravine, covering him with snow and fallen branches. "Better they think we dragged him off with us," Jonah muttered. Lenora stayed close to Morgan as he packed the baby nestled against her chest, finally quiet after the chaos. "You killed him," she said softly, almost like she was testing the words. Morgan paused, meeting her eyes. "I didn't want to, but I couldn't let him take her." Her gaze didn't waver. "Grace knew you'd do what you had to." The words twisted something deep inside him. He swallowed hard and kept packing. They moved again before the light faded, heading higher into the mountains, where few would think to follow in a storm like this. Jonah knew the paths well. It was clear he hadn't been as far from these lands as Morgan had believed. The climb was brutal, the snow waist deep in places, but they pushed on, driven by the knowledge that Kerrigan's remaining men wouldn't stop until they'd avenged him, or at least taken back what he'd claimed was his. By nightfall, they found shelter in a narrow canyon, a shallow cave tucked beneath an overhang of stone. They built a small fire, careful to shield its glow from view. Lenora sat near the flames, rocking the baby gently. Rufus lay back against the wall, eyes half shut, exhaustion etched into every line of his face. Aaliyah stood at the mouth of the cave, rifle in hand, watching the white expanse below for any sign of pursuit. Morgan finally sat beside Lenora, his hands trembling slightly as he reached for the baby. "May I?" She hesitated, then handed the child to him. The weight of her in his arms was overwhelming. Tiny, warm, fragile, and yet somehow she felt heavier than anything he'd carried in his life. "She's got Grace's eyes," Elia said quietly from the entrance, his voice softer than Morgan remembered. Morgan looked down at her, his throat tightening. "She's got her strength too." Lenora watched him, her expression unreadable. "Grace trusted you with her life, and now with hers." Morgan swallowed hard, staring into the baby's wide, unknowing eyes. "I won't fail her." But as the fire crackled softly and the storm raged outside, Morgan couldn't shake the unease settling over him. Kerrigan's death hadn't ended this. Somewhere out there, his men were regrouping, fueled now, not just by loyalty, but by vengeance. And when they came, and Morgan knew they would, it wouldn't be a fight they could win by running. For the first time in years, Morgan Tate understood what he had to do. He wouldn't run anymore. He would finish this one way or another. The fire burned low, casting long shadows on the cave walls. The storm outside had quieted to a whisper, the wind sighing through the canyon like a warning. Morgan hadn't slept. He sat cross-legged near the dying embers, the baby curled against his chest, her soft breaths warming the collar of his shirt. Lenora lay curled beneath a blanket a few feet away, her hand resting on the edge of the cradle they had fashioned from a saddlebag and quilt. Elias crouched at the cave mouth, eyes fixed on the valley below. Rufus slept fitfully, a blood-stiff bandage wrapped around his head, his rifle still within arm's reach. "They're coming," Jonah murmured, without looking back. Morgan didn't need to ask how he knew. He felt it too. A heaviness in the air, a pull deep in his chest, like the earth itself was bracing for blood. "How many?" Kelb asked quietly. "Hard to say," Jonah replied, finally glancing over his shoulder. But Kerrigan wasn't lying about having more men, and they'll be angrier now. Morgan adjusted the baby carefully, brushing his thumb across her tiny fist. "If we keep running, she'll grow up hunted." Grace didn't want that for her. Elia's eyes narrowed. "Then what's your plan?" Morgan rose slowly, setting the baby back into Lenora's arms. "We end it here tonight." Lenora stared up at him, her face pale. "You'll be killed," maybe Morgan said simply. "But if we don't stop them, we'll never be free. Neither will she." They worked in grim silence. Jonah and Rufus laid traps along the canyon, mouth ropes strung between rock spikes buried just beneath the snow. Anything to slow the advance of horses. Morgan prepared their weapons, checking every rifle and revolver until his fingers felt numb. Lenora, though terrified, helped however she could. She tore strips of cloth for bandages, packed what food they could carry, and swaddled the baby tightly in case she needed to run. By the time the first orange glow of dawn touched the horizon, everything was ready. Morgan stood at the canyon mouth beside Elia's rifle-steady revolver, holstered at his hip. Rufus took position behind a boulder to their left, his aim covering the narrow path that snaked toward them. The silence stretched thin. Then faintly at first came the rhythmic pounding of hooves. The riders appeared slowly through the snow-veiled trees, dark shapes moving with deadly intent. There were more this time, at least a dozen, maybe more. At their head rode a man Morgan recognized instantly. Kerrigan's foreman, a brute of a man named Garrick, with a scar that carved across his jaw like a brand. "You're a dead man, Tate," Garrick roared as they closed in. "You should have stayed buried with your wife." Morgan's stomach twisted, but he didn't flinch. "Wait!" Jonah said sharply, his voice steady. "Closer!" The riders surged forward, hooves thundering, snow kicking high behind them. Now Jonah barked. Rufus fired first, the shot dropping the lead horse mid-stride. It crumpled, sending its rider flying headlong into the snow. Morgan fired next, his bullet striking another man square in the chest. The canyon erupted in chaos. Horses screamed as ropes snapped taut, toppling riders. The traps did their work, sowing confusion as men tumbled and weapons clattered to the ground, but still too many pressed forward. Jonah fired again, his shot clean and deadly, while Morgan swung his rifle like a club as one man charged him head-on. The blow landed hard, sending the man sprawling, but another was already behind him. Morgan Rufus shouted. A shot rang out, and the second man collapsed. Elias lowering his smoking rifle with a grim nod. Through the chaos, Garrick dismounted, his revolver glinting in the pale light. He strode toward Lenora, who was crouched near the back of the cave with the baby. "Get away from her!" Morgan roared, charging forward. Garrick turned, his grin cruel. "You think you're saving her, Tate? You're just damning her to your cursed name." He raised his gun, and Jonah barreled into him from the side, the two men crashing to the ground. The revolver skittered across the ice. "Go!" Jonah shouted as Garrick clawed at him, fists swinging wildly. Morgan dove for the gun, fingers closing around the cold metal, just as Garrick broke free, slamming Elias back into the snow. Tate Garrick bellowed, lunging toward him. The revolver cracked once, then again. Garrick stumbled, his eyes wide with shock, before collapsing heavily into the snow. The remaining riders faltered, their leader's death cutting the fight from them. A few tried to rally, but Rufus's steady fire and Aaliyah's deadly aim dropped two more in quick succession. Then finally the survivors fled. The canyon fell silent again, save for the wind and the ragged sound of Morgan's breathing. He lowered the revolver, slowly staring down at Hatch's still form. "It's over," Elia said, his voice quiet but certain. Morgan turned toward Lenora, who was clutching the baby so tightly her knuckles were white. She looked at him with wide, tear-filled eyes, but for the first time there was no fear in them. They buried the dead at the edge of the canyon, covering them with snow and stones. No words were spoken. There was nothing left to say. When it was done, Morgan stood at the edge of the ridge, staring out over the vast white expanse. The storm clouds had broken at last, sunlight spilling across the land like a promise. Lenora approached quietly, the baby nestled against her chest. "She'll be safe now," she said softly. Morgan turned to her, something unspoken in his eyes. For the first time. "Maybe she will." Jonah joined them, leaning on his rifle. "What now?" Little brother Morgan looked down at the baby Grace's child, their child now, and felt a weight lift from his shoulders. "We go home," he said finally. "And we start again." But even as the words left his mouth, he knew it wasn't that simple. Because somewhere beyond these hills, Kerrigan's allies were still out there, and they wouldn't forget. Morgan tightened his grip on the rifle. If they came, he would be ready. The descent from the ridge felt endless. Snow and ice clung stubbornly to every slope, slowing their pace to a crawl. Rufus limped heavily. One arm looped around Aaliyah's shoulder, his bandaged head still starred with dried blood. Lenora followed close behind Morgan, clutching the baby so tightly her arms trembled from the strain. Every step felt wrong, too exposed, too quiet. The fight at the canyon had won them time, but Morgan knew in his bones that it hadn't ended things. He could feel it in the way the forest held its breath, the way even the wind seemed to hush as they walked. By mid-afternoon, they reached flatter ground, where the snow thinned just enough to reveal patches of frozen earth and dead grass. Ahead, half hidden by a line of frost-covered pines, sat a cabin, small, sagging, forgotten. Morgan halted, raising a hand for the others to stop. "Empty?" Jonah asked quietly, already scanning the treeline. Morgan studied the crooked door, the broken windows, the way no smoke curled from the chimney. "Looks that way. We'll stay here tonight." Lenora's brow furrowed. "What if they find us?" "They won't," Morgan said, though he wasn't sure if he believed it. "Not before we're ready for them." Inside the cabin smelled of rot and old dust. The roof sagged in places and one wall had partially caved in, but the hearth was intact. It was enough. Jonah and Morgan worked silently, repairing what they could, propping boards against gaps, brushing aside years of dirt and ash. Rufus eased himself onto a chair so rickety it looked like it might collapse under his weight, rifle still within reach. By dusk, a fire crackled in the hearth, its glow filling the one-room cabin with a fragile sense of safety. Lenora sat cross-legged on the floor, the baby cradled against her chest as she hummed a lullaby too soft for Morgan to recognize. Her voice wavered but didn't break, and the melody filled the space with something that almost felt like hope. Jonah crouched near the door, methodically sharpening his knife. The rhythmic scrape of steel on stone was the only other sound. "They'll regroup," Jonah said, finally breaking the silence. His voice was quiet, but there was no mistaking the weight behind it. "I know," Morgan replied, sitting opposite him. "You've got two choices," Elia said, setting the knife aside and fixing Morgan with a steady gaze. "Keep running or make them stop for good." Morgan stared into the fire. "I've been running for years since Grace died, maybe even before that, and all it's done is leave everyone else to fight battles I should have finished myself." Jonah leaned forward slightly. "So you're saying," Morgan's eyes met his brother S. "I'm done running. This ends with me." Lenora looked up sharply. "You'll be killed." Maybe, Morgan said, his voice steady. "But if we keep running, she'll grow up hunted." Grace didn't want that for her. Neither do I. For a long moment, Lenora didn't speak. Then with a quiet nod, she said, "If this is how it ends, then make sure it matters." Rufus gave a faint grin, despite the pour in his face. "Knew you'd say that, Tate. Wasn't any point patching me up if we weren't going to finish the job." They spent the night preparing. Jonah laid out weapons on the table. 2 rifles, 3 revolvers, and a scattering of ammunition. He divided the bullets carefully as though he knew each one might matter. Rufus, though clearly exhausted, cleaned his rifle with steady hands, refusing to rest. Morgan studied a rough map of the land scratched into the dirt floor with the tip of his knife. "We strike at the ranch," he said quietly. "That's where Kerrigan built his power. Without them, there's nothing left for his men to rally behind." Jonah nodded. "Burn it to the ground." Morgan didn't answer, but the grim look in his eyes was enough. Sleep came in snatches. Morgan woke more than once to the baby's soft cries, Lenora whispering soothing words in the dim glow of the fire. Each time he opened his eyes, the same thought struck him. Grace should have been here, not Lenora. Grace should have been the one singing to their daughter. By the time the first weak light of dawn broke across the horizon, Morgan was already awake, sitting cross-legged near the hearth, staring at the coals. They set out before noon. The cabin, with its fragile promise of shelter, disappeared behind them as they moved west toward Kerrigan's ranch lands. Every step forward felt heavier than the last. Rufus limped, but didn't complain. Jonah carried 2 rifles slung across his back, his eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of pursuit. When they crested the final hill, the sight of Kerrigan's estate made Lenora gasp softly. It sprawled across the land like a wound, rows of white fencing corrals packed with cattle, a grand house that gleamed even under the gray winter sky. Dozens of men worked the yard. Ranch hands hired guns loyal to the man Morgan had killed. "There are too many," Evelyn whispered. Morgan stared down at the ranch, his jaw tight, his hands steady. "This is where it ends." Jonah gave a single nod. "Then we make it count." They waited until nightfall. From the hill they watched as men finished their chores, as the barn lamps flickered to life, as the ranch slowly settled into its nighttime rhythm. Morgan crouched low, checking his rifle one final time. His hands didn't shake. "Stay here," he told Lenora softly. "No matter what happens, don't leave until I come for you." Her eyes shone with tears, but she nodded. "Come back to her," she whispered, brushing the baby's tiny hand against his rough cheek. "I will," Morgan said, though the promise felt heavier than anything he'd ever spoken. When the first shot rang out, it shattered the night. Jonah bullets struck true, dropping a guard at the barn door. Shouts erupted instantly, men scrambling for weapons, boots pounding against frozen earth. Morgan moved like a man possessed. His rifle cracked again and again, each shot precise, deliberate. Rufus covered their flank from behind a low stone wall, his fire cutting down anyone who tried to circle them. Chaos swept the yard as the barn doors swung open, horses screaming in panic as they kicked against their stalls. Jonah hurled a lantern through the open doorway, flames blooming bright and fast. The dry wood caught in seconds. By the time the barn was fully ablaze, painting the night in orange and gold, Morgan had already pushed through the yard with Jonah at his side. This wasn't about escape anymore. It was about erasing everything Kerrigan had left behind, everything that could rise against Grace's child. One day the fight stretched on gunfire, smoke shouts blending into a blur of violence and firelight. Men tried to rally, but Morgan cut them down. Each shot fueled by years of grief and fury. One by one, Kerrigan's loyalists fell. And still, Morgan pressed forward toward the big house, toward the men who had held power, through fear and cruelty toward the final reckoning.